Thank you so much, Professor Zunes, for this interview. We're mainly going to talk about the foreign policy of the United States. If you describe the foreign policy of the United States towards the Middle East, what are you going to say?
Unfortunately, it is very similar to U.S. foreign policy to other parts of the global South, where the United States has put aside its stated values of human rights and international law for narrowly defined strategic expediency. The support for Israel has come despite increasing dissent within the United States by those, not just those who might be anti-Zionist in terms of their ideological orientation, but those who simply believe that it's wrong to support any country that violates international legal norms. So I see a combination of the narrow strategic interests, seeing Israel as an ally of the United States, what one former Secretary of State called our unsinkable aircraft carrier, the close ties between the military-industrial complexes, between the CIA and Mossad and intelligence gathering, covert operations, and many other ways that the United States sees Israel, because of its strong technological and military prowess, as one that can support hegemonic aspirations. And it's compounded by the fact that you also have the right-wing Christian fundamentalist evangelicals who see Israel's fulfillment of biblical prophecy and support Israel for these religious reasons. You see, I think, a lot of traditional liberals have a very idealistic view of Israel as a home for an historically oppressed people. You also have the influence of AIPAC and other right-wing Zionist lobbies that try to help to make it more difficult to challenge U.S. policy. And putting all those together, I think you do see, on the one hand, some, as I mentioned, similar patterns of U.S. foreign policy elsewhere, but hardened by by particularly vehement ideological and strategic concerns.
Well, having said all of these things, it comes to my mind like we jump to the relationship between Israel and the United States. This kind of strategic ties between the United States and Israel, who actually benefits behind it? Because look at what's going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
The United States declared several times they are against the war.
Mm-hmm.
President Biden announced peace agreement,
mm-hmm.
but it seems like over there they don't care. So does this because there is no control over Israel
mm-hmm.
from the United States,
mm-hmm.
or there is double standard here,
mm-hmm.
they talk about something, but on the other hand,
mm-hmm.
so what do you think?
Well, the United States does in fact have quite a bit of leverage over Israel, but the Biden administration has refused to exercise it. President Eisenhower in the Suez Crisis in 1956 was able to pressure Israel to withdraw from the Sinai and from Gaza. President Carter, during the first invasion of Lebanon in 1978, forced Israel to withdraw from most of the conquered territory. You had
Reagan.
Reagan in the invasion of Lebanon in 1982-83 pressured Israel to pull back. Twice Obama forced shorter wars in Gaza by pushing Israel not to launch a ground invasion, and he was quite capable of overcoming the lobbying of AIPAC and others and signing the Iran nuclear agreement. So the United States definitely has leverage if it chooses to use it. But Biden seems to be particularly ideological in his hardcore support for Israel. He was that way in the U.S. Senate as well, went beyond the perfunctory pro-Israel consensus to a much more extreme level, and he's certainly been showing his proclivities in that direction as president. Now, one can certainly argue that strategically it has actually hurt American interest. Indeed, there are more and more people who are very much within the foreign policy establishment who question U.S. policy, not out of concern for human rights and international law, but more because they see we are alienating much of the Islamic world, we look like total hypocrites when it comes to opposing Russian aggression in Ukraine, or other concerns about human rights and non-proliferation when violated by by other countries. And we've seen how isolated the United States is in the world. The United Nations, casting the sole negative vote to veto a series of UN Security Council resolutions, or being one of less than a dozen countries in the 193-member UN General Assembly to vote against very modest resolutions targeting Israel. So there's certainly a concern that for whatever strategic rationale there may be to support Israel, it actually hurts U.S. interests in the longer term. In addition, there are plenty of Israelis who argue that U.S. backing of Israel's policies of the hard-right government has not been good for Israel either. It has only encouraged extremist movements and terrorists and others who threaten them. And there are Israelis who recognize that Palestinian rights and Israeli security are not mutually exclusive, but in fact mutually dependent upon each other. But rather than allying with these more moderate, progressive Israelis, the U.S. policy is tended to be, despite occasional finger-wagging, saying, oh no, you shouldn't really do this, they've continued to provide unconditional military aid, a diplomatic umbrella at the United Nations, and other ways to encourage the more hardline elements like Netanyahu.
You mentioned privileges. The United States have some privileges of supporting Israel. What kind of privileges?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, Israel's been our most reliable ally in the region, and they have the military-industrial complexes of the two countries work closely together on new jet fighters, anti-missile defense systems, and the like. Israel's the dominant air force in the region. They have the CIA and Mossad collaborate on intelligence gathering and covert operations. They funnel arms to third countries that are U.S. allies or pro-U.S. insurgencies, even countries the U.S. couldn't support for political reasons, like apartheid South Africa, the Nicaraguan Contras, the Guatemalan junta, the whole Iran-Contra deal. Israel was the middleman. More recently, various Kurdish militia and Colombian paramilitaries. They trained U.S. forces in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations. I mean, there are a whole series of ways that Israel has been a very important ally. And even if you look at all the U.S. aid to Israel, the tens of billions of dollars, Israelis don't see that money. 80% of U.S. aid to Israel goes to American arms manufacturers.
So it comes around.
So it is in many ways a subsidy for the defense industry, and more than it is actually supporting Israel. In fact, I've talked to Israeli generals who say it's actually they have to spend, for every dollar of American military aid, Israel has to spend $2 or $3 on training personnel and spare parts, and often for its equipment they don't even really need. So I think there are a whole number of reasons why why there are certainly elements within the foreign policy establishment and political leadership that see advantages. Though again, there are plenty of other reasons why I and some other people would argue that it ultimately hurts American strategic interests.
So okay, well, since we mentioned about this collaboration between Israel and USA, so what's the position of Iran right now?
Well,
between this kind of collaboration and
Yeah. Well, obviously Iran has its own imperialist agenda. They obviously want to increase their influence in the region, and Iran has been formerly Persia, has been a major player in the region going back 2,500 years, and so they're not about to give that up. And I think there are certainly very legitimate criticisms of Iran's role in the region. Obviously, just as there are legitimate criticisms of their internal repression and the like. But the U.S. has never been that worried about. The U.S. has certainly been willing to support other authoritarian regimes. I think the main reason the U.S. has and Israel has such hostility towards Iran is that they're a counter-hegemon. They are essentially a force that is in the way of American predominance in the region. I mean, the concern about Iran possibly obtaining a nuclear weapon. I mean, obviously, I hope they don't. Obviously, it is an interest in the world to try to avoid that. But the threat is not that Iran is going to unilaterally attack Israel or America or somewhere. I mean, that would be obviously suicidal, but because they would essentially be a deterrent to actions by Israel and the United States in the region. And I think, and indeed, a major reason for the support for Israel, as well as some of the monarchies of the Arab Gulf, is that they are seen as important in countering Iranian influence, and indeed the and Israel, similar reasons, puts a priority on stopping Iran for the same reason.
Okay, let's back to the United States again. We are witnessing right now a huge uprising, demonstration to support, and condolence to Palestinian people, to ask for ceasefire, but there is a huge crackdown against them.
Yes.
So is this justified, this kind of oppression against any voice that criticized, the action of Israel right now?
Well, one doesn't have to be a critic of Israel or U.S. policy towards Israel to be very concerned about the crackdown simply on civil liberties grounds. I mean, there is a history, of course, of cracking down on student dissent, especially it does target U.S. foreign policy. We saw this during the Vietnam War. We saw this in the movements against U.S. intervention in Central America and the anti-apartheid movement targeting South Africa. But it's been particularly serious in regard to challenging U.S. policy in support of Israel. And it raised very serious questions about academic freedom and the right to protest, the right to dissent.
There are professors were forced to resign.
Yes, and I've written a number of articles about this. They're very topic. I think one major reason for this is that unlike these previous protests against U.S. Policy and supporting dubious allies, is that opponents of the protests, supporters of U.S. policy, can use charges of anti-Semitism as a means of suppressing them. And there certainly have been cases where some pro-Palestinian supporters have unfortunately crossed that line, but the vast majority have not done so. And this is the excuse for cracking down. And there's a tendency. I mean, for example, if during some of these previous movements I mentioned, somebody said, "Oh, there's a bunch of communists," there might be a few real communists in the mix, but most people would say, "No, that's just McCarthyism. That's just a false, charge to try to discredit them. That shouldn't be taken seriously." But when somebody says, "Oh, they're anti-Semitic," a lot of liberals, who may not know much about the conflict, would tend to be, "Oh, well, maybe there's something to this," just like charges of racism or sexism or something like that. I mean, there's often a tendency that if you are not in a target group, to take the word of somebody who is. For example, as a white male, I'd be reluctant to say a woman, "Oh, that's not really sexist, that's your imagination," or "That's not really racist, that's your imagination." And I think people are reluctant to push back against those claims, even when they are totally fabricated, even though they are being used to suppress legitimate dissent. And because there are laws on the books that require colleges and universities to suppress discriminatory activity. For example, if there were people in fraternities or in a football team who were engaging systematic sexually inappropriate things towards women, and the college or university refused to challenge it, they could be sued. Or if there are some right-wing students who are putting racist graffiti or hanging nooses from trees or things like that it was hard for black students, and the university didn't do anything about it, again, they could be sued. And so I think that this fear of lawsuits and other threats, even if there's no real basis to them, leads universities to be extra cautious and be willing to crack down. So I think it's a combination of the fact that they have a tool to crack down on dissent in general they didn't have in previous times, and also the fear of litigation and other kinds of pressure has given them an excuse to engage in this kind of repression. A final reason I would mention is that many of these protests have focused on the issue of divestment, of withdrawing the stock holdings and other support from corporations to support Israel's war and occupations. And if you look at most of the major universities, less so the smaller colleges, but certainly major universities, you'll find that if you look on the board of trustees, you'll find people who are CEOs or board members of some of these very corporations, Raytheon, McDonnell Douglas, the major arms manufacturers, and in recent years, colleges and universities, even public ones, are more and more dependent on corporate contributions and funding from wealthy donors, who even if they are not strongly Zionists per se, do not want their investments being challenged by a bunch of college students who are pushing for a more ethical investment policy.
Yeah, but I want to stay in this conversation a little bit about the public opinion here. Mm-hmm. I witnessed like a huge anger among the protesters, to the level that like Aaron Bushnell took over, took his what we call it, committed suicide.
Yeah.
What we say. This is like this anger, it's motivated by what? Yeah. It's just or maybe they felt like they were deceived about.
Oh yes. I there is great passion and anger, especially among young people.
It's not just for humanity's sake or something. This is something I feel like they took it personally.
Yeah, yes, very much so. And I think, though I must say, I've seen this before. I'm old enough. I was a child at the time, but I certainly remember this kind of passion around the Vietnam War, mm-hmm. and again around U.S. support for the death squads and these repressive right-wing military juntas in Latin America. I mean, it is. I think especially for Americans, because we really pride ourselves in belief in the rule of law and freedom, and what Biden keeps talking about, the rules-based international order. And so when we see our government engaging in policies that are contrary to these values, it feels like a betrayal on a very personal level, because so much of our identity as Americans is for freedom, democracy, rule of law, and if our government's taking policies that are contrary to that, again, it's betrayal. And so that really brings up passion. Also, the fact is that, far more so than previous wars, young people in particular, they can see the slaughter, the killings every day by just looking into their phones. It's not a hidden war. I mean, the United States could, bomb some village in a remote area of Vietnam, people would never see it.
Even in Iraq.
Or Iraq, for that matter. Exactly. But now
it's you can't hide anything.
You can't hide it, and so I think that also it has become a major factor in the passion that we're seeing, and the anger.
Do you see this soon? It's going to happen here? There is a leadership here in the United States, can do this with these two monopoly of two political parties. Look at the Green Party. Right? The Green Party, and I found it maybe according to their statements, they want to have a solution, right. But they don't have the chance.
Okay. Sure. Let's remember that both the Democratic and Republican parties at one point supported the Vietnam War. Both of them opposed sanctions in South Africa. The Republican Party and much the leadership of the Democratic Party supported the invasion of Iraq. We have seen many throughout history. The two major parties have had a degree of consensus on these questionable foreign policy positions. But when people organized and applied pressure and made it a political issue where there are political consequences, particularly on the Democratic side, for continuing and supporting these repressive policies, they have changed. And so I think it's only a matter of time. We cannot expect the leaders to suddenly become more enlightened and on their own change policies, but the pressure from below can really make a difference. And so I do, and especially given how this younger generation takes a much more progressive, much more enlightened view towards Israel-Palestine than the older generation. In a couple of decades, they're going to be the leaders. And so I think the change in U.S. policy and an equitable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is inevitable. The question is how many people are going to have to die in the meantime.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Zunes. Thank you for having us here, and we are looking forward to have you again in the future. Thank you so much.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's go.